On the morning of May 3, 1297, in the market town of Lanark, the authority of English rule in Scotland shattered in a single violent moment. William de Heselrigge, the English sheriff appointed by King Edward I, was cut down inside his own quarters. By nightfall, his body lay dead, and William Wallace had crossed a line from outlaw to open rebel. This was not a symbolic protest or a romantic gesture of resistance. It was the opening act of a campaign that would turn Scotland into a burning frontier and force England's most powerful king to confront a war far more savage than chroniclers later wished to admit. To understand why Wallace's revenge would become so feared, one must first understand the world that created him. Scotland in the 1290s was a kingdom humiliated and occupied. In 1296, Edward I of England, already known across Europe as a ruthless and methodical conqueror, invaded Scotland after political disputes over succession and fealty. Scottish nobles were defeated, King John Balliol was deposed, and the Stone of Destiny was hauled south to Westminster as a trophy of domination. English garrisons were installed in towns and castles, and English sheriffs ruled with harsh efficiency. Taxes were raised, land confiscated, and resistance punished publicly. William Wallace was not born a king or noble lord. He came from the lesser gentry, likely born around 1270, possibly in Elderslie or Ellerslie, though medieval sources disagree. What is not disputed is that he grew up witnessing English encroachment and the erosion of Scottish autonomy. Later English records dismiss him as a brigand or criminal, but such labels were often used to delegitimize rebels who refused submission. Scottish sources portray him as a man driven by personal loss and national outrage. By early 1297, resistance was already simmering. Small bands attacked English supply lines, ambushed patrols, and melted back into forests and hills. Wallace emerged from this chaos as something different. His killing of Sheriff Heselrigge was not random violence. Heselrigge was the embodiment of English authority in Lanark, a man responsible for enforcing Edward's rule and punishing dissent. Some later traditions link the attack to the execution of Wallace's wife or companion, though contemporary records do not confirm this. Whether motivated by personal vengeance or calculated rebellion, the act sent a message that no English official was safe. What followed was not a series of isolated skirmishes, but a deliberate escalation. Wallace began attacking English strongholds, not with the goal of holding territory, but of making occupation unbearable. English administrative centers were burned, supply routes were severed, English soldiers were hunted in terrain they did not understand. Wallace understood that England's strength lay in its ability to project authority through order and law. His strategy was to destroy that illusion. By the summer of 1297, Wallace had gathered followers from across the lowlands. These were not disciplined knights, but farmers, craftsmen, and dispossessed men armed with spears, axes, and long knives. English chroniclers later described them as savages, but this characterization obscures the reality of a population pushed beyond endurance. Wallace's forces moved quickly, striking where English power was weakest. Towns that cooperated with English rule were targeted, their stores seized and their garrisons killed or driven out. This was collective punishment, intended to force communities to choose sides. The brutality of these actions is often softened in later retellings. Medieval warfare, especially rebellion, was not governed by the chivalric codes celebrated in Romance literature. Wallace did not fight tournaments. He fought a war of survival. English soldiers captured during raids were frequently executed, not ransomed. In a feudal war between nobles, ransom was a tool of profit. In a rebellion against occupation, prisoners were liabilities. Allowing English troops to live meant they would return with reinforcements. One English chronicle records with horror that Wallace spared neither rank nor office. Sheriffs, tax collectors, and collaborators were targeted with particular severity. This was revenge not only against individuals, but against a system. Wallace understood that fear could be as powerful as arms. By making examples of those who served Edward's administration, he disrupted the machinery of occupation. The English response was swift, but initially ineffective. Edward, I was campaigning elsewhere, and his commanders in Scotland underestimated the scale of the uprising. They believed it could be crushed by local garrisons and loyalist Scots. Instead, Wallace's movement spread. In the north, Andrew Moray, a noble who had escaped English captivity, raised forces of his own. Though operating separately at first, Moray and Wallace shared the same objective: expel the English by making Scotland ungovernable. By late summer, English control outside major castles was collapsing. This was not because Wallace defeated English armies in open battle, but because he destroyed the infrastructure that sustained them. Crops were seized or burned to deny supplies, bridges were destroyed, messengers were intercepted. English forces found themselves isolated, unable to move safely, and constantly harassed. The psychological impact was enormous. Edward I had built his reputation on control through law, records, and administrative order. Wallace's campaign mocked that system. Sheriffs fled their posts. Towns hesitated to enforce English edicts. The authority of the crown was being undermined by a man England dismissed as a common outlaw. This period culminated in September 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where Wallace and Moray confronted a major English army. But to see Stirling as the beginning of Wallace's legend is to misunderstand it. The true foundation of his power was laid in the months before, in a campaign of relentless retaliation that stripped English rule of legitimacy and safety. By the time the English marched north to confront him, they were already fighting on ground poisoned by fear and hatred. The consequences of these early actions would echo far beyond Scotland. Wallace forced Edward I to take the Scottish rebellion seriously, diverting resources and attention that would shape English policy for years. He also set a precedent for resistance that later leaders would follow. His methods were harsh, but they reflected the realities of medieval occupation and revolt. This was the beginning of William Wallace's revenge, not a single act of defiance, but a sustained campaign that embraced violence as a tool of liberation. History would later romanticize his cause and soften his actions, but the truth is more unsettling. Wallace's war was brutal because the world he fought in allowed no gentler path. When English rule came to Scotland, it came with chains. Wallace answered with fire and steel. On September 11, 1297, the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth near Stirling became the stage for one of the most decisive and violent moments in medieval British history. The date matters because it marked the first time William Wallace did not merely harass English power, but shattered it in full view of Europe. What followed that day was not the clean triumph later legends preferred, but a brutal reckoning that pushed Wallace's revenge into a new and far darker phase. The English army that marched towards Stirling was confident. Commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and advised by Hugh de Cressingham, Edward I's treasurer in Scotland, it represented the administrative heart of English rule as much as its military strength. Cressingham, in particular, symbolized everything Wallace despised. He was the man who squeezed taxes from the Scottish population, enforced fines, and reduced resistance to numbers on a ledger. To Wallace, he was not just an enemy official, but the living face of exploitation. Stirling Bridge itself was a strategic bottleneck. The English needed to cross it to suppress Wallace and Andrew Moray's forces, who waited on the northern side. The bridge was so narrow that only a small number of men could cross at once. English commanders debated tactics, but arrogance prevailed. Cressingham urged an immediate advance, dismissing Scottish forces as inferior rabble. Wallace and Moray waited, watching silently as English knights and infantry began crossing in fragments. When enough English troops had crossed to be isolated from the main force, Wallace struck. The Scottish army surged forward with terrifying coordination. English soldiers, trapped between river and spear wall, were slaughtered in chaos. Knights were dragged from their horses and killed in the mud. Infantrymen drowned as they tried to flee into the river. The bridge itself collapsed under the weight of panic and bodies. The killing was merciless. This was not a battlefield governed by ransom or surrender. English troops were cut down as they tried to escape. Chroniclers record that few survived. Among the dead was Hugh de Cressingham. His body was stripped, and according to multiple accounts, pieces of his skin were taken as trophies. Later, Scottish tradition claimed Wallace had a sword belt made from it. Whether literal or symbolic, the story endured because it captured a deeper truth. Wallace wanted England to understand that those who ruled Scotland through fear would die without honour. Andrew Moray was mortally wounded during the battle, a loss that would later weaken the rebellion. But the victory was overwhelming. Stirling Bridge was not just a military defeat for England. It was a psychological collapse. English authority north of the Forth disintegrated almost overnight. Garrisons abandoned posts. Sheriffs fled south. Communities that had cooperated with English rule now rushed to align themselves with Wallace. What followed was the most controversial phase of Wallace's campaign, the phase history often softens or omits. With English power broken in much of Scotland, Wallace did not settle into governance or negotiation. He chose expansion and retaliation. By late 1297, Wallace led raids across the border into northern England, carrying the war into Edward's own territory. These incursions into Northumberland and Cumberland were devastating. English villages were burned, storehouses were looted, livestock was driven north. English chroniclers describe civilians fleeing in terror, churches stripped of goods, and settlements left in ruins. Wallace justified these actions as retaliation for years of English occupation, during which Scottish lands had been pillaged and taxed into submission. From his perspective, England was finally tasting the consequences of its policies. The brutality was deliberate. Wallace understood that Edward I's strength rested on economic stability and the perception of control. By attacking English soil, Wallace shattered the belief that the war could be contained. Northern England, once a secure rear area, became a vulnerable frontier. Edward could no longer treat Scotland as a distant problem. At the same time, Wallace's reputation transformed. To many Scots, he was no longer merely a rebel leader. He became the guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. In March 1298, official letters were issued under Wallace's authority, addressed to merchants in the Hanseatic League, declaring Scottish ports open for trade now that English control had been broken. This was not the act of a bandit, it was the assertion of sovereign power, yet Wallace's rule was harsh. He governed a land exhausted by war, famine, and fear. Resources were scarce, loyalty was fragile. Wallace relied heavily on intimidation to maintain order and discourage collaboration with England. Those suspected of aiding English forces were punished swiftly. Medieval justice was unforgiving, and Wallace's administration reflected that reality. Mercy was seen as weakness in a land still surrounded by enemies. Edward I could not ignore this challenge. By early 1298, he prepared a massive response. The English king personally led an army north, determined not merely to defeat Wallace, but to annihilate the rebellion. Edward's campaign was methodical and ruthless. Villages suspected of aiding Wallace were destroyed. Crops were burned to starve Scottish forces. The land itself became a weapon. Wallace faced an impossible dilemma. He could not meet Edward's army head on in traditional battle without risking annihilation. Instead, he attempted to starve the English, retreating and destroying supplies in their path. This scorched earth strategy inflicted suffering on Scottish civilians as well, deepening resentment and desperation. Wallace was no longer just fighting England. He was fighting time, hunger, and internal division. The confrontation came on July 22, 1298, near Falkirk. There, Wallace made a stand. His army formed schiltrons, dense circles of spearmen designed to repel cavalry. Initially, the formation held. English knights were repelled by forests of pikes. But Edward adapted. English longbowmen unleashed volleys that tore into the packed Scottish formations. Once the schiltrons broke, English cavalry charged again. The result was slaughter. Falkirk was not merely a defeat. It was a turning point. Wallace survived, but his army did not. Many of his followers were killed. Others deserted, convinced the rebellion was doomed. Wallace resigned as guardian of Scotland soon after. Yet even in defeat, his legend deepened. He had forced Edward I to personally intervene. He had turned a conquered kingdom into a bleeding wound in England's side. The aftermath of Falkirk hardened Wallace further. No longer leading armies, he turned again to the shadows. Raids, assassinations, and sabotage resumed. English officials lived in constant fear. Wallace became a ghost, striking and vanishing, refusing to surrender or submit. His war was no longer about victory in battle. It was about endurance and revenge. This phase of Wallace's life reveals the uncomfortable truth behind the legend. He was not a noble knight seeking glory. He was a revolutionary shaped by occupation, loss, and unrelenting violence. His methods were brutal because they were born of a world where brutality was the language of power. Wallace spoke that language fluently, and England listened. After the defeat at Falkirk in July 1298, William Wallace entered the most dangerous and least documented phase of his life. This was the period when his revenge against English rule became quieter, colder, and in many ways more terrifying. No longer able to command large armies, Wallace transformed into a symbol of resistance that England could not extinguish. His war shifted from open battle to shadow conflict, and it was during these years that English officials came to fear him not as a general, but as an inevitability. Edward I believed Falkirk had broken the rebellion. Militarily, he was partly correct. The Scottish forces were fractured, and many nobles quickly returned to cautious submission. But Edward misunderstood the deeper damage Wallace had inflicted. Scotland had been awakened to the possibility of defiance, and Wallace himself had become a living challenge to English authority. As long as he lived free, English rule could never feel secure. Wallace vanished into the landscape that had always protected him. Forests, marshes, and highlands became his refuge. English records from this period describe constant anxiety among administrators. Sheriffs travelled with escorts. Tax collectors delayed journeys. Messages were rerouted or abandoned. Even when Wallace was not present, the fear of his presence disrupted governance. This was not accidental. Wallace deliberately cultivated uncertainty. He struck unpredictably, targeting individuals rather than armies. English officials disappeared. Collaborators were found dead along roads or in burned homes. Supply depots were sabotaged. Bridges collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Each act reinforced the same message that English power in Scotland was conditional and temporary. English chroniclers portray Wallace during this time as cruel and vengeful, and there is truth in this portrayal. Wallace no longer distinguished between military and administrative targets. Anyone who upheld English rule was considered an enemy. This included Scots who benefited from cooperation. Medieval rebellion was merciless, and Wallace's campaign reflected that reality. Betrayal was punished swiftly, often publicly, to deter others. What made Wallace especially dangerous was his refusal to negotiate. Many rebel leaders throughout history eventually seek compromise. Wallace did not. He rejected offers of pardon and submission. To Edward I, this made him uniquely threatening. Wallace could not be bought, intimidated, or absorbed into the system. He existed entirely outside English control. At the same time, Wallace sought support beyond Scotland. Some later sources suggest he travelled to France around 1299 or 1300, possibly seeking aid from King Philip Roman IV, who was himself in conflict with England. While direct evidence is limited, such a journey would align with Wallace's strategic thinking. He understood that Scotland's struggle was part of a larger European contest between crowns. Even the possibility of foreign backing alarmed Edward's court. During these years, leadership of the Scottish cause shifted among nobles such as Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. Their rivalry weakened the resistance. Wallace, distrustful of noble politics, operated independently. This isolation further darkened his reputation. To some Scottish elites, Wallace was no longer a unifying hero, but an uncontrollable force whose actions invited English reprisals. Edward exploited these divisions ruthlessly. Castles were reinforced. Rewards were offered for Wallace's capture. Networks of informants were established. English propaganda portrayed Wallace as a criminal rather than a patriot, emphasizing his violence to undermine popular support. Yet despite these efforts, Wallace remained at large for years, a constant embarrassment to English authority. The final betrayal came in 1305. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, reportedly through the actions of Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to England. The capture itself was swift, but its consequences were staged with chilling calculation. Edward I did not intend to merely execute Wallace. He intended to erase him as a symbol. Wallace was transported to London in chains, paraded through the city as a warning. The date of his execution, August 23, 1305, was chosen carefully. It was meant to demonstrate that English justice could reach even the most defiant rebel. Wallace was charged with treason, a charge he famously rejected by stating he had never sworn allegiance to the English king. This declaration struck at the heart of Edward's claim over Scotland. The execution was among the most brutal reserved for traitors. Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Each stage was designed to humiliate and destroy. His head was placed on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, cities he had once defied. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who resist England. Yet the execution failed in its ultimate goal. Instead of erasing Wallace, it immortalized him. His death transformed him from a dangerous insurgent into a martyr. Stories of his courage, defiance, and suffering spread rapidly. English brutality, meant to deter rebellion, instead hardened Scottish resolve. The irony is unavoidable. Edward I believed that fear could secure his empire. Wallace demonstrated that fear could also destroy it. The savagery of Wallace's revenge, the very acts that made English chroniclers recoil, were the product of a system that offered no mercy to the conquered. Wallace mirrored English violence back at its source, stripped of legal language and royal ceremony. In the years following Wallace's death, the Scottish struggle continued. Robert the Bruce, once cautious and conflicted, eventually rose to leadership. When Bruce was crowned king in 1306, and later won his own decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314, Wallace's legacy was unmistakable. The tactics of resistance, the refusal to submit, and the belief that England could be beaten all traced back to Wallace's campaign. History often prefers heroes who are comfortable to admire. William Wallace is not one of them. His revenge was not clean or noble by modern standards. It was brutal, personal, and relentless, but it forced a mighty empire to confront the cost of domination. Wallace mattered because he proved that even the most powerful king in Europe could be defied by a man with no crown, no army, and nothing to lose. By the time William Wallace was executed in August 1305, Edward I believed the Scottish rebellion had been decapitated. The man who had humiliated English authority burned its towns, slaughtered its officials, and carried war into England itself, was dead. His body was destroyed with deliberate cruelty, his remains scattered like warnings across the realm. Yet the final and most uncomfortable truth of Wallace's revenge is this: it did not end with his death. In many ways, it only began to reveal its full consequences after he was gone. Edward, I underestimated the long memory of violence. Wallace's campaign had reshaped how Scots understood English rule. Before 1297, resistance had been fragmented, cautious, and often led by nobles who negotiated as readily as they fought. Wallace changed that psychology. He proved that defiance did not require noble birth, foreign armies, or papal blessing. It required resolve and a willingness to meet brutality with brutality. The methods Wallace employed had lasting effects. English administrators in Scotland never again felt secure. Even during periods of apparent submission, fear lingered beneath the surface. Garrisons were strengthened. Punishments became harsher. Surveillance increased. Ironically, these measures only reinforced the sense of occupation and injustice that Wallace had exploited. English rule grew heavier, not lighter, and with each tightening of control, resentment deepened. Robert the Bruce, who would later emerge as Scotland's king, learned from Wallace's successes and failures. Bruce did not adopt Wallace's relentless personal vengeance, but he absorbed the strategic lesson that England could be beaten through endurance, terrain, and psychological warfare. Bannockburn in 1,114 was not an isolated miracle. It was the culmination of a resistance culture Wallace had helped create. Bruce also understood something Wallace never had the chance to implement fully: legitimacy. Wallace ruled in the name of a deposed king, and through fear as much as loyalty. Bruce combined military resistance with kingship, law, and diplomacy. Yet without Wallace's earlier campaign, Bruce might never have believed victory was possible. Wallace had already proven that Edward I was not invincible. From the English perspective, Wallace remained a deeply troubling figure. English chroniclers continued to portray him as a savage criminal long after his death. This was not merely propaganda. It reflected genuine discomfort. Wallace did not fit the narrative of honorable medieval warfare. He attacked civilians, administrators, and collaborators. He rejected ransom. He ignored feudal conventions. In doing so, he exposed the fragility of a system that relied on those conventions to maintain order. This is why later history often softened Wallace's image. Romantic retellings emphasized battles and speeches, courage and sacrifice, while downplaying the scorched villages and executed officials. A cleaner hero was easier to celebrate, but stripping away the violence also strips away the meaning. Wallace mattered precisely because he refused to play by the rules imposed by conquest. His revenge was not random savagery. It followed a grim logic shaped by occupation. English rule in Scotland was enforced through law backed by force. Wallace answered by dismantling that law through fear. Each sheriff killed, each town burned, each raid across the border was a statement that domination would carry unbearable costs. The execution of Wallace, intended as a deterrent, became a symbol of English cruelty. Scots remembered not just that Wallace died, but how he died. The spectacle on London Bridge resonated far beyond England's borders. It confirmed what Wallace had claimed all along, that English justice was merely violence dressed in legality. In world history, Wallace represents a recurring pattern. Empires often believe that overwhelming force can extinguish rebellion. Wallace demonstrated the opposite. When power is imposed without consent, resistance adapts. It becomes more ruthless, more personal, and harder to control. Wallace did not defeat England in his lifetime, but he transformed the conflict into one England could not easily win. Modern audiences may struggle with this reality. The desire for heroes who align neatly with contemporary morality is understandable. But history is rarely so accommodating. Wallace's revenge was brutal because the world he inhabited was brutal. Judging him without acknowledging that context risks misunderstanding both the man and the age. William Wallace forced a reckoning between empire and identity. He showed that national consciousness could be forged not just through crowns and treaties, but through shared suffering and defiance. His legacy is not one of purity, but of impact. He mattered because he changed what Scots believed was possible. In the end, Wallace's greatest revenge was not the blood he spilled, but the future he made inevitable. Scotland would continue to resist. England would be forced to negotiate. The idea of a free Scotland survived, scarred but unbroken. Wallace did not live to see that future, but it was built on the ground he soaked in blood.